Hey YouTube, this is Guy. As you can see on the table today, there's an Orient Ray II. Now, this is a pretty nice little watch, but the big thing that was on my mind when I placed my order for it was, is this a Seiko SKX Killer? The Orient Ray II is a really high value 200 meter dive watch at a price point of between $150 and $175, and it is probably one of the closest competitors to the Seiko SKX. So we're going to see a lot of comparison between these two watches in this video. Now we're kind of hitting the dog days of summer here. Probably post this around July 1st, so halfway through the middle of the year, and I thought, what better time than to review this sports/diving watch and compare it to probably one of the most popular sports diving watches in the $200 price point. So let me say right off the bat, in most regards, the Orient Ray II is a better, higher quality watch than the Seiko SKX. If you were to ask me which is a better value for my money, I'm probably going to suggest you buy the Orient. There's a however to amend that statement though, and that is that I personally still prefer the Seiko. Now, while the Orient does have more features and it is perhaps a little bit higher quality in most regards, the Seiko SKX has, as a friend put it to me, a certain X factor. When I look at this Orient, I see all sorts of subtle nods to other watches. In particular, I see nods to the Rolex Submariner and the Omega Seamaster in its design. On the other hand, with the Seiko SKX, there's a certain, charming character to the aesthetic that is more distinctly unique and appealing to me. Now, that's just 100% personal opinions. You may or may not agree, and that's totally fine. But while I do, again, feel like the Orient probably is a higher quality watch, it has nicer, better features, again, it just doesn't stand on its own as a unique and distinct design. When I look at it, I see hints of many other watches in it. And I just feel like the SKX has, again, its own distinct charm to it that no other watch really, particularly in this price point, can dethrone for me. Now, that said, both of these are excellent watches, high value watches for the price point, and neither one would be a bad choice to own. In it, you really can't go wrong. So what I'm going to do here, first things first, this is obviously the watch. The box that it came in, I'll give you a quick look at that. It's just a white cardboard box. Is there anything on the outside? No, nothing at all other than the logo. Pop that box open real quick and give you a look. We got the Orient user manual in there, and then a pretty nice inner box. It's hinged, comes on a pillow. This is where I keep the extra links, and the little Orient hang tag. The Orient model number for this specific Ray II, FAA02004B9. That's the black dialed Ray II. But, not a big deal. Like, we don't really care all that much, I suppose, about the boxes. But if we're comparing apples to apples, the Orient boxes, in my opinion, have always been a little bit nicer than the cheaper run-of-the-mill Seiko boxes. We'll go ahead and get that out of the way, though. Sorry, I bumped the camera. There's also your international warranty booklet. I guess I forgot that in there. Anyway, we'll go ahead and get that out of the way. Bring the Ray into center frame, and we're also going to bring this guy into frame, the SKX007. Both of these are the black dialed variants of the respected watches. Of course, there's a Pepsi version of the SKX, and there's a blue dialed version of the Ray, but so I wanted to again, be as close to apples as I could, so I got the black dialed versions of both of them. I'm going to go ahead and zoom the camera in here, and we'll talk about the specifications on the Ray and do quite a bit of comparing between these two watches. Alright guys, hang on one sec. Alright, first let me preface this by saying that I have extensively reviewed the Seiko SKX007 and 009 in the past, so I do encourage you to go into my library and check out the independent review video on that watch if you're not super familiar with the SKX. That said, I'll compare these pretty significantly, so maybe this will give you enough information on both of them side by side, I don't know. So specifications, I'll try to do that quickly here on the Ray. This watch, the case diameter on my calipers comes in at 42 millimeters, not including the crown, so the diameter side to side here, not including the crown. The thickness on this watch comes in at 13 millimeters, the lug width 22 millimeters, and from lug to lug, from the top of the watch to the bottom of the watch, what I like to call the watch's wingspan, I measured out at 47 millimeters. In comparison to the SKX, we'll kind of show them side by side, they're almost identical in size, and it doesn't really look that way because while the size is very similar, the design is quite a bit different. But the SKX is, on my calipers again, 42.5 millimeters in diameter as opposed to 42 millimeters. Both are 13 millimeters thick, both have 22 millimeter lugs, and that lug to lug width or wingspan slightly smaller, 1 millimeter smaller on the SKX, the watch on the right here, at 46 millimeters as opposed to 47. So in the regard to sizes, they're so close to identical, we could just say they're identical and we'd be splitting fractions of a millimeter in a couple of dimensions. That said, again, they do kind of present quite a bit differently to me. They wear a little bit differently on the wrist. Going on with the rest of the specs here on the Ray, it does have a screw-down crown at the 3 o'clock position. Of course, the Seiko has a screw-down crown at the 4 o'clock position. We do have a 120-click unidirectional bezel. The crystal on the Orient is a hardened mineral crystal. We do have a day and date complication at 3 o'clock, and this watch is 200-meter water resist. It has a screw-in case back with no see-through or exhibition window at all. Which, that's common for dive watches. They generally don't have a exhibition or see-through window. And we have glow-in-the-dark luminescence on the markers and handset of this watch. I don't know the trade name for the luminescence that Orient uses, however, whereas I know the Seiko has their LumiBright. Could be the same luminescence, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. It comes on a stainless steel bracelet, which has a fold-over safety clasp with push-button deployant. Or fold-over safety, I guess, I don't know what to call that, clasp, push-button deployant clasp. I don't know the proper terminology there. But anyway, it's got this little fold-over, plus the push buttons. Last but not least, as far as the specs go, this watch runs on the new 22 joule F69 automatic movement, which is an upgrade, a relatively recent upgrade to the movement on this watch. We won't talk about the previous generation, the Ray 1, I guess. This is the Ray 2. We're not going to touch on that. I've never owned the Ray 1. I don't know that it's in production anymore, so probably most people aren't going to be shopping for it anyway. So we'll just sort of focus in only on this version of the watch. Quickly to discuss the movement, and we'll kind of compare the movements of these two watches here. The movement on the Ray, again, is a 22 joule F69 caliber automatic movement versus the Seiko running their 7S26. Both of these movements run at, they're very, very similar. They both run at 21,600 vibrations or beats per hour. That's how many times the little second-hand ticks per second would be 6 vibrations per second. They both have roughly the same power reserve of 40 hours when fully wound. So in that regard, these are very, very similar. Now, the 7S26 has a very long history of being reliable and robust, albeit not that accurate, but a history of potentially going very long periods of time without breaking, without needing service. The newer movement in this Orient, the F69, doesn't have that track record or history, so we can't really say, is this movement more robust and reliable? The data's just not in yet, I guess. It's still too new. I would suspect that it probably is. I bet these are very similar movements, but I can only guess. Now, the way that these movements differ are in a few key but not unimportant ways. The Orient movement is better in my opinion, three regards. Number one, it is hand winding, so you can unscrew the crown and wind the movement when the crown is out in the first position. The Seiko 7S26 movement is not hand winding. The only way you can wind the movement is by shaking the watch or wearing it on your wrist and getting the automatic rotor on the inside to spin. So that's sort of an annoyance for most people regarding the Seiko, and it's one extra star for the Orient. Number two, the movement is hacking. So when you unscrew the crown on the Orient and you pull it out to the set time position, the second hand stops, the clock stops running, and you can set the time and then restart it. The Seiko movement does not hack. That's another little star in the features and functionality column for the Orient. And the third thing that I find better about the Orient is the specs from the factory guarantee a better accuracy. The F69 movement in this Orient watch, according to the manual, will be within an accuracy range of plus 25 seconds per day to minus 15 seconds per day. On the other hand, the 7S26 movement is not nearly as accurate out of the box. I mean, it can be, but the range of acceptable tolerances is much wider at plus 40 to negative 20. So again, plus 25 to negative 15 on the Orient, plus 40 to negative 20 on the Seiko. So while either one of these watches could be more or less accurate than the other out of the box because it's largely luck of the draw when you buy one of these watches, if you were to do a larger comparison of like hundreds of samples, in general, I would expect that the Orients would be more accurate on average. That may or may not matter to you, and at some point in the future, I'm going to do a little discussion on the importance of accuracy and precision. To me, it matters. I want my watches to be as accurate as possible. I'm not unreasonable in my expectations on these value-priced, affordable wristwatches. I don't expect to get a Seiko or an Orient like either of these to be within 2 seconds per day. I'm not expecting to get Rolex accuracy out of these watches, but I want them to be as accurate as possible. And you have a better chance of getting an accurate watch, more accurate watch, if you buy this Orient. So if that matters to you, that's another factor to keep in mind. Between the hand winding, the hacking, and the tighter tolerances for accuracy, the movement is better than the 7S26. But the 7S26 does, again, have that very long history. It is very widely regarded as a reliable and robust movement that should never let you down, where we don't have that track record here on the Orient. So, that's basically all I want to touch on as far as the movement is concerned. But there's a few little check marks in the Orient side, in the Orient column, when we're considering which one is a better watch. Now, as far as the quality, the design, the features, and the functionality, I mean, really, most everything is going to be given to the Orient. First things first, let's talk about the case and the case back. They're very, very similar. The design of the Seiko case, I personally prefer. It's got this sort of almost a vintage look to it. But if you want a more kind of, I don't know if contemporary is the right name, because I mean a Rolex isn't really contemporary, right? The Rolex Explorer, it's been around forever. But it has more of that look. Mainly it's because the crown is going to be at the 3 o'clock position. You have these very distinct and pronounced crown guards on the right-hand side, whereas when you look at the Seiko, the crown guards kind of just flow off the side of the case. The crown itself is a little bit smaller on the Orient, but I don't know if that's a big factor or not. The lugs and all of the lines basically on this case, it's got this more traditional dive watch, and traditional, I don't know if that's the right word. Typical, I mean, it kind of looks almost like every other watch to me. Whereas again, the Seiko, which I said in the intro, has just got this very unique character to it. But I mean, this is an attractive watch. Don't get me wrong. I just see all of these nods to other watches when I look at this Orient. It looks a little more Submariner-esque, a little more Seamaster-esque. The Seiko just looks like a Seiko. You know what I mean? It looks like what a Seiko should look like. Now, the side of the case, we do have, it's not highly mirrored polish or anything. It's okay. It's like a medium quality polish, about the same quality. The finishing on both of these watches is basically going to be about the same. Okay polishing on the sides of the case. They pick up plenty of fingerprints, as you can see. The top of the case on the lugs, and of course the bracelet are mostly brushed, with the exception of the bracelet having these polished sort of edges on the center links. But we're talking case right now. The back side of the case does have a screw-in case back, and it's got this kind of logo. I don't know how well it's picking up there. Maybe if we open up the bracelet, we can get in there a little better. Orient, there's these little dolphins. It's fine, whatever. It's about this, again, the same kind of quality and fit and finish as the Seiko, in my opinion. They're very similar, and if we look at like the polishing on the sides of both of these cases, the Seiko is much older and much more worn, so it's going to have some scratches and some distress. The Orient is very new to my collection, but as we can see, I think the quality of the polishing is about the same. If we look at the tops side by side at like the lug area, the quality in the brushing, if you look at the tops of the lugs on both of these watches, again, it's about the same. I think that in this regard, the finishing is very much equal on these two watches. But it's the design of the case in particular that's quite a bit different. And again, this Orient just kind of looks like every other watch to me, whereas the Seiko is just, it's a Seiko, and I like that. Moving along, again, we can talk about the crown on the Orient. There is the little Orient logo on the crown, sort of engraved, probably laser etched or something. The crown is smaller, and the knurling on the crown, the grippiness, the texturing, is probably not as good as the texturing on the Seiko crown. The Seiko crown's a little bit easier to grip, I guess, because it's bigger and because the texturing's a little bit better. However, out of the box, the threading, when you're unscrewing the crown on the Seiko, every Seiko, I've owned several of these SKX models, the threading has been awful. Whereas the threading on this one, and again, this is my only example, so maybe I got lucky, but the threading to unscrew it is much, much better. It's pretty smooth. I mean, it's not like as smooth as some of the higher end watches that I have had experience with, but when you unscrew it, it pops out to the first position, which is the hand wind position. Of course, again, the Seiko has no hand winding. When you hand wind this movement, I don't know if you can hear that. It's a little gritty. It's a little unrefined feeling. That was the same complaint that I had about the Orient Bambino, which I've previously reviewed. If you saw that video, I felt like the hand winding, and they're probably virtually the same movements, maybe with minor variations or differences, but I find that the hand winding action is very just gritty and unrefined, but it seems to work. I've hand wound this watch a number of times. I don't wear it often, or I haven't been wearing it often, so the power reserve has run out multiple times, and I unscrew it and wind it up, and it's been fine ever since. Again, it is a hacking movement, so if we pull it out to the second position, see the second hand stops running there, and we can easily set the time to whatever we want, as you would expect. The first position, of course, hand winding. The second position, you can set the day and date. I'm not going to do that. It's set the way I want it, but just pull it out and you can quick set the day and date just like you can on the Seiko. That's fine. Screwing it back in, there is quite a bit of resistance because as you're screwing it back in, putting that downward pressure on the crown, you're also winding the movement. Just because spinning it in that direction winds the movement. So it's kind of got quite a bit of resistance, but I mean, it's not an issue. You can screw it back down just fine. So again, in comparison to the crowns on these two watches, the Seiko's crown is a little bigger, a little bit easier to get a grip on, but the threading was awful on all of my Seiko watches. I had to like get in there with a piece of dental floss, wax dental floss, and kind of clean the threads up a little bit to make it screw in and out smoothly. Whereas I didn't have that issue here on the Orient. Just wanted to point that out, that at least on this example of one, the Orient was better in that regard. The bezel on these watches, now this is something that the Seiko I find to be, has a better bezel, or at least the action. Now aesthetically, you could, I don't know, pick whichever one you like better. I like the Seiko's bezel better aesthetically. I think that the aesthetics of the Orient bezel is okay. It's fine. It's a little glossy. Like you can see the reflection that it's picking up off of my studio light. Like over the 40 down here, there's a light just off to my left. It's kind of glaring. The bezel on the insert on the Seiko watch is more matte, so it doesn't really have much glare. But the fonts, I prefer the fonts and the little dots all the way around on the Seiko better than I prefer the on the Orient bezel. But that's just, you know, personal taste and aesthetics. So there's nothing wrong with a person liking one over the other. Both of them have at the 12 o'clock position a little loom pip, and they're both 120 click unidirectional bezels. Now, the action, the spinning action on the Orient is not as good as the action on the Seiko. It's very stiff. I'm sure you can hear that. It's very loud. The grippiness, I don't know the right word for that, the texturing on the edge of the bezel is difficult to kind of get your fingers on. It's still kind of slick, slippery, and the bezel isn't very tall, so there's not a whole lot of material to grip onto. So yeah, overall, I mean, it's not a fail, but the Seiko beats the Orient in regards to the action and usability of the bezel. If we look at the Seiko, it's got a thicker, taller bezel. You got more material to grab onto. It turns much easier. It's not nearly as stiff, and overall, it's just better, in my opinion. So that's one of the things that the Seiko does better than the Orient. I don't think that that's super important because I bet the vast majority of people that wear either one of these watches don't scuba dive with it, and that's really the main reason you would use the elapsed time bezel. Sure, you could use it to keep track of time for, I don't know, if you're boiling an egg or whatever, but like as a work tool, as like what its intended purposes are, you know, most people aren't really using it for that anyway, so it's probably not going to be much of a factor for anybody. Next, we'll talk about the crystal briefly. Seiko has their Hardlex crystal, which is got kind of this little chamfered edge around the crystal. I don't know how well that's picking up on the camera. Right between the bezel and the crystal, there's like this little chamfered edge. It's kind of a cool little aesthetic thing. I don't know if there's any functional reason for it. The crystal on the Orient is a hardened mineral crystal. Presumably the crystal on this Orient would scratch a little bit easier. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about like the hardnesses of different crystals, in particular the Seiko Hardlex versus the Orient's mineral crystal. But what little I do know suggests that maybe the crystal on the Seiko is a little bit better. I don't think when it boils down to it, it makes much of a difference. Now, when we're talking about the aesthetics of a watch, usually one of the main things we're talking about is the dial layout, and the markers, the indices, and the handset. And in this regard, while I do, again, have sort of an affinity for the Seiko and its kind of throwback charm, the Orient is kind of better. And here's why. All of the indices are very nicely applied markers. They have a stainless steel outline at the 12, 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. All of those markers have a nice stainless steel outline. The handset stainless steel, all of the markers are applied with luminescent material, and I'll bring in a comparison of the luminescence between the Seiko and the Orient. I don't really see much of a difference when in my brief testing of these two. I don't know if the Orient's lume lasts nearly as long as the Seiko's lume, just because I haven't had the watch that long and really tested like what does the lume look like 8 hours after it's been charged up. But off the bat, off of an initial charge, I don't really see a whole lot of a difference between the two looms. But anyway, back to the handset and dial. Everything's a little bit higher quality, higher class, I guess. It kind of almost dresses up a little bit because, again, of all of these applied markers. The Orient logo is this nice little, the heraldry, the lions with the shields. That's a nice applied marker. The date window is outlined, day and date is outlined in a nice stainless steel outline. And everything on the Seiko is just very plain. There's a ton of dust on the dial. I'll go ahead and wipe that off for you first. But besides all of the dust, it's just a very plain layout. There's no outlines on any of the markers, no outline on the day and date window. The handsets on these are both very similar. Stainless steel hands. Our hands are quite similar. Of course, the Orient's has got just a little bit more kind of detail in it. The minute hands, again, are very similar, but the Seiko's has got an arrow. The second hands differ quite a bit in that the Orient has a red tip, and the tip has got a little pip of lume in there. The Seiko has a pip of lume on the counterbalance side, and the tip is painted all white. But they are quite similar in design. I mean, you have the circle markers. You have the outer chapter ring. It is almost like a rehaut or a flange. It's creates that set in depth on the dial because of how the outer chapter ring is, and they're very similar. The chapter ring on the Orient, to me, it's just a little more subtle. But, more or less very similar dial layouts. But the Orient's is just kind of, again, to me it looks a little nicer, a little more classy. But, again, it kind of looks like every other watch. I mean, you get those little circle pips. That's very Rolex-y, you know what I mean? With the stainless steel outlines. Of course, the Rolexes are outlined in probably white gold, if I'm not mistaken. But, nevertheless, it's just the whole package on the Orient, again, it just sort of has way too many nods to other watches, and the Seiko, again, is just a little more distinct. Now, something you've probably noticed on the Orient is that the date, the 29 there, it's not lined up perfectly. It's misaligned. The date window on this watch does not line up, framed up perfectly in that little square. It's not awful. But the reason I bring that up is that clearly both of these watches suffer from the same kind of awful quality control issues that I've come to be very familiar with Seiko watches. Now, this particular Seiko is pretty squared away, but getting misaligned bezel inserts, misaligned chapter rings, misaligned day and date wheels, misaligned hour and minute hands, and by that I mean that, like, if it were exactly 6 o'clock, maybe the hour hand would not be perfectly lined up with the 6 o'clock marker. It might be a little bit ahead or a little bit behind. Anyway, my point is that apparently both of these watches suffer from those same types of quality control issues, because this is my first Orient watch, or Orient dive watch anyway, and I have misalignment on the date window. The day lines up just fine, but the date, again, I'll kind of look at it closely here. You can see it's a little low in the window. It's mildly annoying. Had I noticed it when I first opened it before I took all of the plastic and everything off, I probably would have asked for an exchange for one. I don't know. I don't feel like paying for something that has quality control issues. It's just, my opinion. I know some people wouldn't care. They'd be like, whatever, I don't even set the date. For me, I find it annoying. One of the last things to discuss in regards, to the Orient, and just, the Orient review, and then a comparison of the two watches, is, of course, the bracelet. Now, again, the Orient, it kind of has this, same sort of, it's not a complete knockoff or replica of the Omega Seamaster bracelets, some of the Seamasters anyway, but it's very reminiscent of it to me, with these polished, you have the whole thing is brushed, and then the edges of the center links have this polish that it looks like a number of Seamasters that I've seen. It's like trying to be a different watch. It's not trying to be its own unique thing. That's the way I feel about it. That said, it looks nice, number one. Number two, it's quite a comfortable bracelet. Starts out at 22 millimeters. It might taper ever so slightly down to the clasp side. Let me grab my little calipers here and let's check. I'm curious. I did not do that measurement. But down at the clasp side, it's 20 millimeters. So it tapers down from 22 to 20 millimeters. So a little bit of taper on the bracelet, but nothing too seriously extreme. And then it, terminates at the buckle. The buckle signed Orient. Again, we have this fold-over safety portion of the clasp. Dual button deployment. The swing arm is just the cheap stamped metal that we're used to in these value affordable watches, but it's got a nice, it looks like a bead blasted finish. It's not brushed, but it's not a super shiny finish. One shortcoming of the bracelet, limited micro adjustment holes, only 3. But overall, the entire bracelet, let me also mention that the end links are hollow end links. I have no problem with hollow end links, though, if they're done well, and these are done well. The hollow end links on the Seiko are done well also. But the bracelet on the Orient is better than the bracelet on the Seiko. Assuming you like the aesthetic, and I guess you could say that about either of these. Some people don't like the Jubilee aesthetic that comes on the Seiko. You might not like this sort of Omega Seamastery aesthetic that comes on the Orient. I mean, it's kind of like a oyster, but again, with these little polished center bits, to me, it's just Seamaster-ish. The one thing that is quite a bit better, though, is the clasp on the Seiko. It does have fold-over safety portion, but no push-button deployments. It's just this really tight friction clasp. That sucks. It sucks bad. Also, the clasp feels just kind of thinner material and lighter weight. The only thing better that the Seiko clasp has is many more micro holes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 versus just the 3. The Seiko Jubilee bracelet is well known as being really loose and floppy. And again, this bracelet, it's pretty sturdy. There's not a whole lot of flex to it. Which is more comfortable? I would say they're about the same. I mean, I think that the Jubilee is fairly comfortable. I recently put it back on. I've been wearing the Seiko with a NATO for the majority of the time that I've had it, but I recently put it back on the Jubilee and have been wearing it with that. I actually like it. I just wish, if anything, the clasp was better. That would be the main thing. And this kind of does have a better clasp, so that's the main upgrade. To me, in regards to the bracelet that comes on the Orient, it's just a little bit better. So, I mean, basically, just a little bit better. That's probably the best way to sum up this review. Everything about the Seiko is just a little bit better. Not everything, again, the bezel action on the Seiko. Did I say everything on the Seiko? I meant the Orient. Everything on the Orient is just a little bit better. But, with a few exceptions, like the action of the bezel on the Seiko is a little bit better. The price on the Orient is a little bit better. I think you can buy these, again, between $150 and $175. I want to say I saw them for $169, maybe on Amazon. I'll put a link in Amazon, to Amazon on both of these watches if you decide you want to get either one of them or both of them. If you buy it through my affiliate link, I get a small commission that helps the channel out. Helps me afford to buy more stuff to review. So that's cool. So let's go back to the beginning. And that question is the Orient, the question that I had for myself when I was ordering this Orient to evaluate it. Is it a Seiko SKX Killer? I mean, it could be if you weren't already sort of emotionally invested in the SKX. That's the way I would describe how I feel about it. I'm kind of emotionally invested in the SKX. I've had it for a while now, and I really like it. I love its aesthetic, and the aesthetic of the Orient doesn't blow me out of the water. It's just a nice looking watch. It's not unique or special, you know what I mean? It's like if I just wanted kind of a generic looking, nice generic looking watch, the Orient's awesome. It looks like everything else to me. Whereas the Seiko, again, it just has this distinct uniqueness to it. But quality wise, I think that the Orient does edge out the Seiko a little bit in almost every major category of comparison. It's not a big deal. It's not huge. Again, you couldn't go wrong with either one of these, but that's just my 2 cents on it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you got any questions or comments, leave them down below. Again, in the notes, I'll have links to all my social media. I'll have links to these watches on Amazon if you want to get them. And yeah, that's basically it. Thanks a lot. I will be back, probably not till next week, with some more watch reviews. I got a whole table full of watches. Some very, very generous viewers loaned me some watches, so I've got some exciting stuff coming up. All right, guys, thanks. I appreciate it. Take care.